this podcast, we're going to be basically talking about the whole point of the debunking of the all the myths surrounding Parler and this whole thing of trying to claim censorship and monopolies and all these other things surrounding the whole thing with it. And we're going to basically show how these things are merely just lies and trying to basically claim this all this stuff with it, and meaning that showing that Parler was is merely just a group of nationalists, and that they're not their founder is not libertarian. He was never libertarian. He's his whole group around not only him but his uh, financial backers such as the Rebecca Mercer and Dan Bongino are nationalists as well, and they support government force to enforce their views. When we see all the things first, but now we need to examine Parler at first. Now, when you can, now users have noted that people in the media have actually noted with it the way Parler was used is that basically when you first went on Parler, you were shadow banned until you were basically had enough posts that what they felt was right were enough right thing posts. Now this is completely different from when if you would do such things as Facebook, Twitter, other types of mainstream. To be shadow banned on those with it, you essentially have to put yourself outside of the mainstream to end up being shadow banned. You have to do something for them to kind of take notice to be shadow banned from those areas. Something posting something within outside of the mainstream and enough of those posts outside of the mainstream to kind of like push you out, or at least from the what are called from the core values of the company, such as like Twitter. Twitter obviously is slightly left leaning, so if you're basically going to be pushing things kind of like really more nationalist, it's going to it's going to push you out, obviously, because you're more apt to be they're more apt to be sympathetic to socialists, but they're going to essentially put you into an area. If you're pushing nationalism, they're going to end up shadow banning you. But if we look at Parler, unless you are putting nationalist posts, enough of them, you are going to be shadow banned the whole time that you're there. You are not going to make it out of this essential penalty phase of being, or suspension phase at all, to basically have the freedom to basically be out of this point. They're going to essentially keep you in the suspension phase where you cannot really reach anybody else until you actually post what they feel is agreeing with what they feel is the right way to think. And I guarantee you, if you're posting things in a fake way with it to get them to think that way, the moment that you tend to vary from that with it, I guarantee you that they're going to basically put you right back in this phase. But now this is not confirmed, but usually with the way most social media sites with it, if you tend to vary your way that you're acting with it in extreme ways, with it going one way to the other, back to the other way, they tend to revert back. Like if you're going from like an extremist back to like normal to more into extremist views with it, they're going to put you what they labeled you as the initial point. And I guarantee you, if they whatever they were viewing you at the start with, whatever policies they were using at the start are going to be reinstilled in that point. They're not just going to let you free to do that, because it obviously will change the culture. And the idea with this was essentially to create a safe space for nationalists. This was the whole point. It was not about free speech. It was just about the safe space. And this was the whole point of Parler. It wasn't really about actually doing this. And it was from nationalists all the way over to some of the most crazy, egregious uh, things you would find out there, from the more mild nationalists all the way over, like the regular Trumpers, all the way over to the most insane, egregious things as you would find. Now, some people were complaining about the obvious deplatforming of Parler. Now, here's the thing: we need to understand how Parler arranged their system. Their system, as we've seen a couple of places kind of go into it. ZDNet actually went into it and kind of explained their whole system. Their system was based on Linux, which kind of limits their system to begin with. Uh, Being it's not one of the more popular operating systems when we compare to obviously uh, Windows and Apple with it, but obviously that was, I don't know if that was an actual direct point, but when we break it beyond that, we end up seeing some of the core things for the whole back line of the system. Now we see that their actual storage that we found was actually done deliberately with Amazon. Now we can we can say things negatively or positively about Amazon having about 40% of the storage out there for cloud storage, but we can actually complain the same way about the U.S. government having this massive amount of cloud storage for uh, grabbing people's data. I mean, they have a huge amount, just as much as Amazon, if not more. And we can say that if they release this amount, that there would be far more ability for other companies to get into the mix. And there's a lot of regulations that cause other companies to make it harder to get into the mix and be able to be more massive competitors. And the government makes it far harder for this to happen because they want to control a massive amount of the data so they can actually spy on people. And this is another problem that's come about. And because of their whole thing on cybersecurity, and because they want to basically spy on everybody because they think everyone's a terrorist, and because of this whole thing. Now, when we start to view that's obviously more storage, and there's only going to be at certain points in time, there's only going to be so much cloud storage that's out there for people to have. And obviously, you have certain companies that are going to have their cloud storage. You're going to have certain, and then obviously corporations need their cloud storage. And eventually, with it, you're going to have to work with a lot of these. If you want large amounts, you're probably going to end up having to work with a major corporation for this, which means you're going to have to comply with their terms of service of how they want you to act and how they want your company to act within those grounds. Now, this is where a lot of things happen. We have that. We also have other ones within their backline were actually, for email was Microsoft, and some of their other core functions was Google. And obviously we had Google and Apple for their availability in the application stores to have quick application to the smartphones. Obviously, they can have people download directly and explain how people can do that by downloading the file with it and telling their people to set up their phones to accept unknown sources. This can easily be done, but the fact is uh, to avoid it so they can actually get around the usage of Apple. But the fact is, when you get around for the other ones, is Google was not going to be able to be fully worked around because that was one of their core things for their systems. And they need to understand when you start working in these things, you're going to have to supply by their terms of service. Now, Google had stated that even before the election, they had warned them about these issues when it came down to violating the terms of service. So they had essentially warned them for months. Now, I don't know about things such as Amazon. We've not had points such as Amazon and Microsoft, but we've seen such things as Google at least stating that they had warned them of violation of terms of service. As far as early as I've seen, at least September. So this is well before the elections. Of people violating their terms of service, of users violating their terms of service. Now, these things were actually ignored by Matzi, the CEO, and the rest of the ownership group, stating that they were doing something about it. Meanwhile, nothing was being done. And there were continued warnings and basically saying, if you don't do this, we're going to remove you from both our App Store and remove you from our services. And this is, I guarantee you, this is pretty much across the board. Now, what ends up happening is when you do this, you're going to be removed from all these services. Now, while Microsoft was only for email services, obviously we can find unbelievable high amounts of email servers for email services. There's plenty of them out there. Now, the quality of them could be hit or miss. But they could have done around this and kind of transferred all the and used the main servers to transfer all the data. Now, that wouldn't have been that's not a major issue. The major issue is with all of the core, all the other core areas that mainly exist through Google and Amazon, and this is where they're basically having their issues with. And the audacity with them trying to claim that they could have gotten on within a week wasn't, this was another one that was actually refuted by ZDNet. The idea that they could have gotten back on within a week or a little more than a week, they stated with it to actually switch everything over. It would have taken with that amount of data, would have taken them between a year to 2 years. And this is basically other people that have dealt with large capacity cloud storage, and these are experts on that. So we know that that was actually a lie that was being spread by Parler. And if you can actually search on ZDNet about that point. And this had actually been completely disputed. And when we found the thing with it, and that's why when we hear that the CEO says that he was getting death threats, it's not likely, because the fact is the only access to his information was on Parler, and Parler had people that were basically friendly to his whole thing. And Parler's offline, so there is no actual access to his information. No one knows beyond the city he lives in where he's at. They just know that he's in Henderson, Nevada somewhere. And we can look right here for Henderson, Nevada. Just looking at the population size, we can actually see that the total population estimate in 2010 was over 257,000 people, 257,729. Population estimate in 2019 was 320,189. So the theoretical idea that someone's going to find him is insane. When it comes down to when we start to look at some of the more notable people, we know that there's quite a few famous people, so that would mean if he's wealthy, that he's probably living in a gated community, and that he's not going to be easily accessed. And we see that there's quite a few wealthy people, and so there's not likely that people are going to find him. And to see that with it, we can pretty much guarantee with something like this, he's probably living into a gated community. So the theory that he's been getting death threats, we could pretty much sell that. Then we end up seeing, so we end up finding that whole thing there with it. Now, when we start to look at the idea of where people are trying to claim that this is some sort of monopoly. Now, this is another thing that people need to understand. This is not a monopoly. Anybody has they're trying to say it's the idea of deplatforming as a monopoly. No, because the fact is there is we do not have a right to have access on a private business. When we need to view ideas of major social media companies, Twitter, Google with YouTube, access to other things such as Facebook, Instagram, many others out there with it that have been along the years. You do not have an access to them, just like you do not have access to being printed in a newspaper, in a privately owned newspaper. You've never had the access to do that. You never had the access to force your views to be printed there. These are private companies. They can say who goes on it and who does not. They can curate who goes in it and who does not. And when with online with it, this is why we had Section 230. It basically gives them immunity from the damages that for criminal liability who goes on. Now, obviously, they can go a little bit further and actually have an actual corporate responsibility of who can actually cause damage to their of things that cause damage to their companies, such as removing people who are actually damaging it, but that's a complete other area. That's why when we start to see people saying that, this shouldn't be allowed to happen, like when Amazon was doing this, and you also saw that happen when Amazon was basically suspending the donations to people who were essentially giving for people that were actually going against Joe Biden and his basic legal win in the election. We've seen other companies such as Citibank, Chase Bank, such other ones like that with American Airlines, Boston Scientific, BP, Coke, Facebook, Goldman Sachs, Hallmark, Hilton, hotels, Microsoft, Visa, Disney, Airbnb, Amazon, Amex, AT&T, Best Buy, Comcast, Dow, Intel, MasterCard, and Verizon are halting donations to the objectors for a few months or an indefinite period of time. Basically, what I think they're doing is I think they're basically going to do it based on their actions. And what we're seeing is that this is what's happening out there. And what people need to understand is people said, they shouldn't be allowed to do this. Well, again, if we look at the case of, there was a Colorado baker who was protesting the ability to who he can bake cakes for and who he couldn't. Now, obviously, in the end, he ended up losing his bakery, but the end up ruling was that he was free to bake who he wanted to bake for. And this is the whole point. And this is why we get under the same idea when it comes down to who we can give money to and who we don't have to give money to. And that was the idea under the Citizens United ruling, which is a 5-4 decisions in favor of Citizens United, allowing corporations to basically give money under as what it calls, saying that it is a First Amendment right. Now, the same way that you can give money, you can refuse to give money. You're not compelled to give money. You don't have to give money if you don't want to. I mean, when it comes down to every election season, it's free speech. You're not compelled to do anything, just like you're not compelled to vote. Just in the same way, you're not forced. They do not force you to the polls. I mean, if you look at, there's plenty of people who use their free will to actually not vote. And that's in the same way with it. This is why when we start to see this, we end up understanding that this is something at which we're finding the same idea of people are exerting their free will of basically how they want to do this. Now, we've also seen the idea of trying to claim this is a monopoly. Now, frankly, it's not. You obviously have the ability to make your own website. You can make your own social media site. We've actually seen other options out there that have actually have basically avoided the Amazon's cloud hosting service, such as Gab. Gab's offered this, and this is why Gab has actually boomed during this period, because the fact is they're doing it on their own. Now, obviously, there's going to be certain issues with it that, on the popularity with it, because to be a self-sustaining site, you're obviously going to have debate on your site. You're going to have multiple groups of people from all different points of view. Otherwise, you're pretty much not going to last. And the fact is Parler really did not have an actual system for it to last. This is why when we start to look at other ones, such as that are actually very good for pursuing the freedom of speech, such as Reddit. Now, Reddit obviously wants to eliminate any possible threats of violence, and this is pretty much their only basic thing that they go against, and they'll also preemptively do this as well, because obviously they're ones who actually use the AWS, the system as well, for the cloud hosting service. What they do is they're actually doing the same option with basically eliminating the things so they basically fall within the terms of service. And Reddit, if you look at it, is you can go from like kind of normal to weird to you can get to some really kind of messed up things on Reddit. Now this should give you kind of a little bit of a clue where Parler was going into. If Parler could not have kind of within a realm like that with what we saw on Reddit, that should give you a little bit of a clue where they kind of exist in. They kind of exist in something in which is even too messed up for Reddit. And if they could not even exist within this realm, and Reddit, you will find some real weird things on Reddit. And even if you cannot exist within this realm as what you found on Reddit, whereas basically Reddit's pretty much only thing is just don't advocate for violence, and they'll allow pretty much everything else, then you know that Parler was not going to last, because Parler really, it had basically one specific niche group that was going beyond that point. It was going from kind of like your Trumpers, and then going from Trumpers to conspiracy theorists to white nationalists to your like neo-Nazis to, I mean, there was a lot of people like that. With obviously you had some of their right-wing celebrity accounts, but really, and then obviously you had people trying to check it out to see what it was, but really on the whole it was those people were put into a system in which they weren't allowed to really see what was there. It was really kind of like a cult thing. What I mean by cult is not like a kind of niche thing, but rather like an actual cult, because to be initiated in, you had to state the right things. If you didn't state the right things, you weren't allowed to actually really see anything. And that's really what shadow banning really is about. And they use shadow banning out of the gate. Now, you would only use shadow banning out of the gate if there's something that you don't want individuals to see. Now, on a free service that uses advertising, there would be no purpose unless you're trying to hide something. Now, in something such as a pay service, obviously you want them to pay for something to see. There's plenty of pay services out there within which you give them kind of a little bit of a sneak peek, and they have to pay to see the rest of it. There's plenty of pay apps online with it. You'll find pay apps or pay websites online with it for a variety of things out there. Games, for video services, for everything. And frankly, this is just the case with it. Obviously, you will find for where you get limited content from that, and but this is a case where you were getting limited content because of they did not trust incoming users. They felt incoming users obviously could impact the culture of the website, or of the app, I should say. And this is something in which people should have realized that that's what it was about. This was about maintaining a safe space for these MAGA people. They did not want any disruption of that. Any disruption of actually, I don't know, having an actual intellectual conversation could have disrupted it, could have essentially, in their minds, destroyed it. Because when we start to look at some of the founders on it, they essentially are just massive Donald Trump fans and wanted all this whole MAGA stuff to essentially remain unchecked. And if you had some people actually starting to even just merely ask questions and start to basically wanting people to defend their views, this could have been highly destructive to the site. And or have people of opposing viewpoints. This would have been destructive, such as getting people who, such as a lot of them would have defended ideally is no immigration, basically, which is going with the point of view of Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller wanted to essentially shut down immigration, and this is your in many ways with it your baseline thing for the people. They wanted to shut down immigration. This is the whole idea of the border wall, and they wanted to basically do that and lock people in because they viewed it was damaging to American culture and all those other things like this, and all the other lies about how immigrants bring in crime and drugs and disease and all these other lies about this. We can obviously look to the Cato Institute and many other libertarian websites to actually show how this is a complete and utter falsehood. But they do not want to actually be contested on these things. If you look at a lot of them do not want to actually debate. But beyond that point, with it, what ends up happening is you get the echo chamber on these whole things, and they do not want to debate, and they just want to hear like-minded people to express the same exact views of shutting down immigration, as this is one of many issues. So what ends up happening is you end up finding these people having the same views. Now, they might not be white nationalists with it, but they're basically wanting to do this whole thing of saying, oh, it's a good thing that only whites marry other whites. Well, explain why. And when you start to bring up genetic arguments or other arguments like that, they don't want to hear it. To hear why it's actually bad when it comes actually to human health. When you start to bring these things up, they don't want to hear it. And this is the thing that they want, that idea of Parler was wanting to shut down. This is their safe space. Same idea when you find liberals wanting their little cry closets in college. The same ideas of that, and we find the same ideas on that side with it, where they want their little safe space, where they can basically get away from reality, away from intellectual discussion. They don't want to actually defend their views. They just want to basically hear like-minded people say the same things. And what ends up happening is you get more and more tribalism. Basically, everybody goes back in their own little corner, and they just want to hear like-minded people spout the same things. And frankly, what ends up happening is you end up finding these people talk about, as expected, more and more crazy things. Because what ends up happening with social media is you get the thing of everybody wants to go viral. You want to get more users, you have to do something that goes viral. This is to grab more attention. So you try to do something that's essentially outlandish and insane. And what ends up happening is, guess what? When you basically are in an echo chamber, you're going to state things that are completely insane. Conspiracy theories that are completely insane, talking about lizard people. You'll find other things such as who can basically spout out the most buzzwords such as build the wall and globalist and lock her up and all these other all these other Trump slogans and make America great again. You'll have people doing that with it, trying to basically outdo each other on who can spot out the most Trump slogans in their posts, and obviously all caps in their thing with it, or obviously they'll probably try to post a video of it, and then you'll come up with the idea of people trying to come up with these weird conspiracy theories about Democrats, which is obviously the QAnon stuff, saying the most bizarre things that basically don't even make sense. Now, QAnon obviously is most likely someone that come up with something with it, which is basically releasing a couple little small tidbits of real classified information, and then basically starting to spew out the most weird, outlandish things to get people to stay onto the cult, not realizing that there was actually a pedophile within Trump's transition team. George Nadler is actually a person that has been found guilty of bestiality and pedophilia. And for those who think that Trump's going to help out these kids that have been victims of sexual slavery, they've got to be kidding themselves. When you actually hire someone for your transition team that you've been a long-time friend with that has been guilty of those two things, you need to be understanding that he's merely going to be not even lifting a finger on any of that stuff. That it's just going to be, that if he does anything, it's just going to be a normal FBI investigation, then finding something like that, and he, being the egotistical megalomaniac that he is going to take 100% credit for it, so that people can say, see what he did with it, he did this because, QAnon found out about it. And he was going to say that all this stuff happened. Meanwhile, with this QAnon stuff has been complete and utter garbage since the start. You get a couple of small little tidbits of classified information, and then it goes from there to be what it calls some of the most weirdest, outlandish conspiracy theories, like Democrats drinking babies' blood, which is completely the most outlandish, stupid stuff that anybody would actually believe. And they're believing it because you end up starting with something small that was true, and then that ended up being verified by some of the other investigative things, such as WikiLeaks. And then what ends up being is it ends up going elsewhere out there, and then they end up going out there and basically coming up these insane stories. And because it's an actual system of an echo chamber, you're going to get that. And this is the problem when you get echo chambers in social media. And you're going to get that because of everything that's going on. That's why when people are trying to say, oh, when we have this, we're not going to have anything else with it. Well, this is basically what the problem was an echo chamber, and echo chambers create the most insane viral videos. That's basically what ends up happening. If you look at some of the cases with it to show how insane viral videos can get, look at the Tide Pod challenge. That's how insane viral videos can get. Kids eating Tide Pods. This is laundry detergent. And to see from there with it, that's how insane viral videos can get. Now, when you start to get people who are believing that Democrats are uh, drinking baby's blood, think how far you're going to get. If that's if that's actually the baseline standard, think about how far viral videos and viral posts can actually get from there. This is the whole point, and you're going to get very, very far in insane posts from there. And these are people who basically used to be normal, everyday citizens. They're being made to believe this stuff. Now, what ends up happening is the media is not debunking any of this. The media is going along with it because it's financially viable as a good model to make money. And it's not just on one side, it's other sides with it because we've been going through tribalism for 12 years in an extreme manner. With obviously there's been some level of tribalism going on for quite some time with it, because obviously we had tribalism during the progressive era, but which is these people of the progressive era are the same people now. These are the same policies of Woodrow Wilson, the same policies of FDR, the same policies of Teddy Roosevelt. They were anti-immigrant. Uh, they were basically anti-black. They were and anti-other minorities with it, anti-Chinese, uh, and basically against everybody else except for white people. These are the policies that are basically embraced by the whole MAGA culture. Now, not all people in the MAGA culture are going to believe this, because frankly, with the MAGA culture is kind of comprised of kind of a different group of people. Not all people are going to be on Parler with it as well. Obviously, you're going to have your conspiracy theorists, as we've talked about. Obviously, you're going to get like your nationalists as well. You're obviously going to get your people who are white nationalists, your neo-Nazis, people like this, your actual racist people as well. You're then going to get people who are kind of jumping in on his on Trump's celebrity factor. And then the last one is going to be people that are basically just lifelong Republicans, are saying, well, I don't like Trump, but uh, he's a Republican nominee. That's why when people go, well, you're on impeachment, that's why when I want to talk a little bit on impeachment here. This is why when they go on impeachment, well, if you go with impeachment, you're going against all these voters who voted for him. Actually, you're not, because a lot of the voters that voted for him are merely voting for him because he's Republican. That's a lot of them. You have voters who voted for him because he's a Republican, because he's a celebrity, because you had some of them voting for him because of because they're basically obviously the racism and all this other stuff like that. You have some of them because of the nationalism, and you have some of them because of the crazy conspiracy theories. And the fact is, with it, you have the 5 reasons. Well, the fact is that you're going to have one of the 5 reasons, or sometimes multiple reasons, that they voted for him. And the fact is that when you have these lifelong Republicans, they're not voting for Trump because they believe in anything he is. They're offended by what he did, and basically, when you look at those numbers, the vast, huge majority of them are offended by what he did, by trying to rile these people up, and the vast majority of them feel that basically that he doesn't represent the Republican Party. Even though they voted for him basically because they feel that it would be easier for Republicans to get things through with him than without him. They feel that with Biden it would have been harder. That was basically it. That people need to understand that the election was not about pro-Trump or pro-Biden. It was anti-Trump versus anti-Biden. That was it. Either you were anti-Biden or anti-Trump. That was the election. There was not 74 million people voted for Trump. it was 74 million people who voted against Biden. Very few people of those actually voted for Trump, because obviously the only people that were going to vote for Trump were those people that fit into voting on the celebrity of him. Obviously, that's not going to last on this whole MAGA movement, because when he's gone with it, his kids don't have the ability to really grab the people. Neither Donald Jr. nor uh, uh, any of these other kids like Ivanka nor Eric Trump had the ability to really grab anybody. And even when we look historically, we've only seen cases in which one other relative has been able to grab the presidency in any political family. There's been no more than two in one political family at most grabbing the president. And the most we've ever seen for terms is, I believe, 6, and that was previous to the limitations on terms. Since then, we've only seen people be able to grab at most in the modern since they've actually put that in, we've actually seen 3 is the most terms. That means basically is 12 years. 12 years is the most, kind of in the modern era, since they've actually put that through, that someone can actually do that. Ever since they put that limitation through, no more than 3 terms have actually been won. That's by the Bush family. That's George Herbert Walker Bush won 1 term, and his son George W. Bush won 2 terms. And that was it. His first term was barely winning. His second term, because they didn't want any really, during the middle of a couple of wars, they didn't want to really cause any change, and that's why he was able to kind of add some votes in the second term. That's it. And it was first a much weaker opponent, being John Kerry. Even as crazy as we have someone like Al Gore Jr., it shows how weak John Kerry was. And when we start to look at some of these things, we can actually see that that's kind of the history. So when we start to look at some of these things out there, we can see that historically with it, we can see that that's not going to last. Then when we go to the next one, we can see that ideas of conspiracy theories. We have basically on like the QAnon thing. Basically, Alex Jones has already basically called the QAnon theory a bunch of garbage. This is basically going to be huge, on a huge scale, damning with it. We've also seen Lionel also basically calling into question QAnon as well. He has not talked about it in a long time. This is going to basically do some huge damage to the whole QAnon group of people. And it's going to basically eliminate the whole group to basically a small little fringe group. And it's going to eliminate them to basically going smaller and smaller and smaller, because no one beyond these small little fringe people are really talking about it. There's no actual legitimate personalities who are actually talking about QAnon anymore. And when that happens, that means that, and people are calling into question on all of that, it basically means that it's not out, QAnon's not really out there as being considered to at least be considered to be one of the more mainstream conspiracy theories. That means that you're going to lose all of those conspiracy theorists out there. They're going to kind of go elsewhere and focus on the next conspiracy theory out there. Obviously, even other ones that have been debunked as well with it are just not grabbing any people, such as that Antifa being the one storming the Capitol has not even gained any leverage. So you're not seeing anything really gaining leverage, and you're seeing these conspiracy theories kind of just go to the wayside. Nothing's really gaining leverage of anything that really looks plausible. That means when you start to go to the next one, uh, that looks legitimate. This is so you're not going to get him from his celebrity. You're not going to get from the conspiracy theorists. Republicans are not getting him. So that's three right there. Now you're left with basically is the nationalists, and you're left with the people who are racist. Now, nationalism, when we start to actually look at the numbers, we can actually see the core tenets of nationalism are basically is anti-immigration and anti-free trade. We can actually look at poll numbers from Pew. They were actually during 2019. They were actually showing the huge swing in positivity for free trade and positivity for immigration. This is showing that nationalism is not going to live. We can actually look at a global scale and show how nationalism is dying as well. Nationalism is not surviving. So this means that nationalism is really not even part of the Republican Party. This has always been something has always been linked with kind of real old things on the Democratic side. You find this with, and this is why you'll find this stuff with like Bernie Sanders people. So those Bernie Sanders people are eventually going to leave back to him. Once Trump is gone and out of the party, they're just going to go back to Bernie Sanders. All these people like that. That means you're left with one group. These like racist, the alt-right racists, these white nationalists, neo-Nazis, all this stuff like this. Now, frankly, this is a very, very bad group to be associated on Republicans. So Republicans do not want anything to do with them. Democrats do not want anything to do with them. And if this is going to be the core of the MAGA group, well, that's going to be very, very fringe, and it's going to go back to what ended up happening in like the 80s and 90s, where they had neither a home with the Republicans nor a home with the Democrats, where they had nobody to vote for, and they were left with nobody there. It wasn't until the MAGA stuff came around that they actually had a home, that they felt that they could actually join in and kind of sway the votes. Now, this is the whole thing with it. That's the only thing that's left. And when you find that, you're going to find that there's nothing left to the whole movement, and that they're just going to and eventually those people will die out. It just is not a very popular thing. Eventually people go, this is kind of stupid, and especially with younger people, younger people kind of realize that this is kind of stupid. The older generation that feels this way ends up just dying off, so you're left with it end up kind of going away. Obviously, we've obviously seen movements that actually prove that this is actually dying out, because we've seen, at least on the social side, we've seen a lot of things go toward this. Now this is why you find these little small fringe groups trying to fight it, because we're going toward more social liberalism, and these are these little fringe groups that are trying to fight it. Now, they've linked up with some of the other like conspiracy theorists, the people who are with Trump for his celebrity, the people who are basically just voting for him because he's a Republican, um, the people who are with him because they just want the nationalist policy, regardless if it's beneficial to them. They just believe it because they're being told it, because they lost their job somewhere with it, and they think that this is a way to get it back. These outmoded ideas that were actually debunked by Milton Friedman long ago, and which even the left understands, even the mainstream left understands is untrue. So basically the majority of the country understands it's completely untrue. So when we start to view this, we understand that it's basically going in the way that it's going away from the country that they wanted with it, which is basically what we had under the progressive movement. and understanding that the progressive movement is never coming back and it's dead, and it's dead and it's always going to remain dead. And this was basically a short little lived kind of refresher, and this is and the fall of Parler is basically an example of that. And when Trump could not basically go after and put together some things in which were considered kind of more pro-liberty of reducing the debt, reducing taxes, getting us out of war, auditing the Federal Reserve, getting us on a gold standard, or even better yet, getting us on a precious metal currency. When he failed to do this, this essentially got people to bail on him, and he lost his whole initial people that came around with him in 2016. So he was left with those five groups: nationalist, people who were voting for him simply because he's Republican; conspiracy theorists; your basic people who are with him for the celebrity; and or people with him for the celebrity, people that are nationalists, people voting for a Republican. You're obviously, and then the conspiracy theorists, and then obviously the racist group. And that's what you're left with. And that's why when we start to see some of these groups, that they're wondering, like, well, why are these groups being able to, what it called, to act as free companies? We're finding all of these people with it show the same basic disdain for the free market, completely against the actual free market. Now we can actually talk about the actual social impact of the deplatforming and all the things like that, the social impact of that, and what to do about it, and the what it calls, and being a little more fair when it comes down to the terms of service, and being able to apply it kind of even across the board. We can have discussions with it. We can have the users can actually contact the ownership of these sites with it and ask for a very, very clear terms of service, and the terms of service be applied equally. We can actually have that discussion with these companies as individual users, not using government as a big bully. We've talked about this. We've had a lot of people that are actually pro-free market actually show that using the government as our own little bully is completely wrong, and using it as force is completely wrong. Because every side is going to be using it then. Every side is going to say, well, hey, I want to use government as my bully with it to go after my enemies. And this is basically what it is it's an extortion artist. You basically want to extort your enemies to basically get your own free will out of them with it. You basically say, hey, I want my enemies to do this for me. I want my enemies to pay for this for me. And it keeps going back and forth and back and forth. It doesn't matter if you're on the left or on the right. I want my enemies to pay for this for me. I want my enemies to do this for me. Meanwhile, you're basically, all you're doing is you're stealing from the other side. And then the other side goes, well, I want these people to do this for me. And then you're wondering why we have the system of this mixed economy that we have right now. And that's the reason why. Is solely because everybody wants basically revenge on their enemies. The left has their enemies, the right has their enemies. And nobody is actually believing on individual freedom. They've tossed that to the wayside, and they say to hell with individual freedom, and we are only concerned with actually abusing these individuals who actually want their freedom kept, and we are only concerned with actually imposing our will on others. And we find this constantly. And this is just another example. They feel what it calls, we find people on the right there saying, Well, it's a small social media company with Parler, so that they should have more rights than these other companies like Twitter and Facebook. All of them created themselves from scratch, and Parler was using things from other larger tech firms. They did not they did not follow the terms of service. And when it comes down to business contracts, guess what? You need to follow those terms of service. No business should be compelled to do business with another company. Just like there's no law that says that all of your ideas must be published by your local newspaper. There is no law that actually says that. If I want my ideas published, I have plenty of options. I can self-publish in many different options. I can make my own newspaper from scratch. There is no reason for me to go down to the Racing Times in my own city and actually force them to say, you need to print my ideas immediately. I have these articles that need to be printed immediately, even though you don't believe in them. I need you to print them. They're going to tell me basically where to get off at, and tell me I don't have a right because they're a private company, and rightfully so. Now, they could obviously say that that they agree with me what it called printing those things with it, obviously in a voluntary manner with it. But in many cases, especially if I go down like that, they're basically going to tell me to kindly leave before they called security. And that's what ends up happening. And what people that's how people need to realize with this whole thing. And you have the ability to make your own website. You have the ability to make your own private newspaper. You just need to understand that you have freedom of ability. Is just the idea is you cannot force your will upon others. It's the basis of the non-aggression principle. You cannot force your will upon others. And this idea of authoritarian ideas that are coming from the left and the right is frankly disturbing. We're finding it coming from both sides, and this is to the worst level that I've ever seen in my entire life. I mean, I thought the neoconservatives on the left and these neoliberals or neoconservatives on the right and neoliberals on the left during that era with it, during the Bush administration, I thought that was about the worst it was ever going to get when it came down to personal liberty. I thought that we were never going to get any worse when it came down to that. Now we have people basically like your Bernie Sanders people on the left, and we have your nationalists on the right that are basically agreeing on certain things with it. We're basically saying that there's a difference between small companies and big companies. There's not. A company is a company, and a company has the right to conduct business as they see fit. There is no difference between one company and the next. And this is what needs to be understood. And neither side is understanding that. And we're finding this, and this is why they continue to rule in the Supreme Court that there's no difference, and anybody can put their money as they see fit, anybody can conduct their business as they see fit. It's been ruled countless times. Doesn't matter if it's a small baker that they can refuse to participate in a gay wedding, or a company that wants to put their money in a political campaign, or obviously in modern cases refuse to put their money in a political campaign. You don't have to do that. You don't have to participate in a political campaign if you don't want to. And these are the things with it. And we're saying that these are authoritarian things by companies pulling their money from the GOP. No, they're not. They're not actually. They shouldn't be compelled to actually put their money in. That's basically a shakedown operation. That is illegal. There is no legitimate reason that they should be forced to actually put their money into any political party. If they want to, they can. If they don't have to. If they're currently putting money into it, they can actually immediately pull it. And the fact is, because of what ends up happening with people, your Trump fans are offended that basically that they would actually do such a thing, because they basically, instead of actually having ideas, they worship a guy. And these people claim that they're Christians, yet they're worshiping an idol. If there is anything more anti-Christian, this is actually it. This is the most egregious violation of Christianity that you could possibly have. You're worshiping an idol. You're actually violating the basic tenets of Christianity because you're supporting violence. And I do not know where we can actually begin with actually trying to explain to these people why they are not Christian. They've actually essentially abandoned every basic tenet of Christianity. You are not allowed to have any false idol. That is a false idol. Sorry to tell you, but as a lot of people, as libertarian Christians have explained, is Donald Trump is not Jesus, and and when we start to look at the whole thing with it, and nationalism is not Christianity. It is the complete opposite. Nor is the idea of any type of conservatism linked to any Christianity. In fact, when we start to look at some of the ideas of Christianity, we would find them far more consistent with being a libertarian, not with being a conservative. God never contends. Basically goes after his creation. God would never basically state that he wants people limited. We looked at if you look at historic biblical times, you were never restricted from where you could move. This is something, the most un-Christian of ideas, the ideas in which not only your citizens, but other citizens are restricted where they could move. I don't know how we could actually go over this, claiming that basically people based on their country are better than others, even though they are actually Christian. How could you even do such a thing? This is the most un-Christian thing, judging others. And actually, the act of judging others is essentially the most un-Christian of things you could possibly do. The only person that's allowed to basically have actual personal judgment of others is supposed to be God himself. How can they actually have the right to say that, to proclaim that other people of other nations are these rapists and murderers with it when they do not have any evidence, and proclaiming all these other things? This is basically why we say that nationalism is completely not only un-American, it is not even Christian. And this is why we found that the whole progressive movement was devoid of Christianity. It was this puritanical movement of basically having contempt for others, having contempt for people that weren't like them, that weren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. If you were not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you were basically part of the problem. And that was basically the idea of the progressive movement. This is merely a reflection of that whole movement. It's a replica of the whole movement. And when you find people that are basically Catholic, Mexicans, Filipinos, many of these other nations from Central and South America, a lot of the Cubans who are still Christians, some of the other people that are throughout Southeast Asia that are Christians as well. You find a lot of the people who are Christians in many Mediterranean countries still. They're thought of as lower by these people. There's a there's a thought that if you're not Protestant, you're of a lower breed than and a lower stock as everyone else. We've seen the actual promotion of ideas of actual intelligence by level of your race, by level of what country your family is from. We've seen this being promoted, and I've seen this with it where you're actually based on where your family's from, and I've seen this from these people. I've seen this of basically of where they say they're fearful of actual other cultures infiltrating their area and bringing their food. This is basically the same activities that we were finding during the Progressive Era. And this is why when we find that the whole fall of Parler was an actual positive thing. Because it was never, this is basically going to be one of the signals of the fall of the second Progressive Era. And sadly, this Progressive Era wasn't even coming from the left this time, which is the most disgusting thing. Because the first time with it, there were some early ones that were proclaiming at the start with it was they were from the right. Was the fact is they were only starting from the right because there were no openings on the left at the time. And eventually with it, they moved to the left because the fact is that's where they were always there. When we look at Donald Trump's policies, they were always and always have been left-wing. Left-wing authoritarian. This is the whole thing about it. And we find the Republican Party actually accepting it. This is the sad part about it, is they're willing to accept these policies that are completely left-wing authoritarian. They go back to this old type policies of these democratic policies of the Progressive Era, where they were basically, if you wanted to get anywhere, you had to agree with the KKK, where you had these people basically saying, "A Birth of a Nation," watched like a documentary, the words of Woodrow Wilson. This is basically where we find the actual MAGA movement. The MAGA movement is the new progressive, progressive party of today. And when we find the fact is all these complaints, they're just big government liberals that basically they believe in authoritarian actions. And it's why when we saw back then, we saw FDR being very, very friendly, sympathetic with Mao. And there was a reason for that. We've seen pictures of that he was. He was actually working with Mao to essentially harass Japan to get to cause blockades, to cause starvation in Japan. That's how Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. We're finding the same thing with it to harass Iran, to cause Iran to cause an attack, to basically piss them off, to cause an attack on other areas, to provoke them. We're seeing the same thing. We're seeing the same thing with Venezuela. We're seeing the same thing with Cuba. This is the same repeated actions. This is what we're finding everything them do. And this is exactly what we're finding with it. And we're finding basically people like Joe Biden look like some free market capitalist when he's not. When Joe Biden's more just kind of a run-of-the-mill person on the left. And this is what disturbs me. When Joe Biden getting in was a big bump for liberty, that's not a good thing. This is where we find ourselves right now. And we find ourselves basically where we have no option in either party for actual liberty. And this is a very disturbing time for America. That basically where you have to vote libertarian to basically have any option for actual liberty in the future. Because both parties have clearly abandoned the idea of liberty. Where the left at least shows that maybe they support ideas of social liberty. even though they'll basically tax you into oblivion. The right shows that basically when it comes to social liberty, they don't care, and when it comes down to the ideas of of economic liberty, they don't care either. They've just adopted full-on authoritarian ideas because they're adopting this idea of nationalism, which is basically all it is being authoritarian. And until they dump that with it, they're not going to get back to any type of normality. Now this is about it with it. Sorry for going to a rant, but that's basically about it on this whole topic. And bye everyone.